Hey, what's up, everybody? Your servant Rob here, coming live from Geneva, California. And today we'll be going through the Lordship of Christ, chapter 5, the contrast with the world. And here we see Poitras asking us a basic question: how do you differentiate from unbelievers as Christians? And what is the difference between a Christian and a non-Christian, a believer and an unbeliever? So even in that, we're able to start off. It's just how he wants to point things out first in his differences in knowledge. So what we know, how do we know what we know? How do we view the world, in what light do we view the world? So as a Christian, we know that what we know comes from God. What we know comes from the scriptures, and the understanding, the wisdom, and the knowledge that the Lord has poured out unto us. And the biggest difference between the Christian and the unbeliever, because the unbeliever, as we know, can attain knowledge, they can learn things, and we see that from our day-to-day lives. But the biggest difference is that the Christian acknowledges where knowledge comes from and how we are receiving that, and how we can reciprocate that back to God through worship, through thanksgiving, through a thankful heart. But not only that, by His grace, through His Spirit, through the gospel, understanding the gospel will allow us to really acknowledge God for all that He has done for us, even in that, and knowing that all truth comes from God. So that was a beautiful point that Poitras made, and just starting by asking us and really challenging us in that way, and then just moving on by the second point, the common grace. Now, as Christians, we know that common grace, we know scriptures, how it says that it rains on the just and the unjust. And we see God's mercy on the believer and the unbeliever, and how patient He is with His creation, and how the sun rises and it sets for the Christian and the non-Christian. So even in that, it should, instead of us, it shouldn't lead us to point the finger. It should lead us to acknowledge God, and as a Christian, marvel more at how patient and how loving and how holy God really is with those, and why He would even choose to save any. So even in that, understanding the common grace that He gives with that. But not only that, there's a limit to common grace, and we know, as I mentioned earlier, that unbelievers learn things, they know things. I know that, and even Poitras mentions it in the chapter, that Christians learn from non-Christians. So even in that, I know that right now a big thing is social media, podcasts, and someone very popular on YouTube, Joe Rogan. He's drenching the world with his worldview, and as Christians, we have to be careful where we choose to, what wells we choose to drink from. So even in that, even though it's knowledge, we should be very careful how to distinguish knowledge, how to decipher, how to, in a sense, be able to know what source is really, where it's really coming from. And not to say that it's all bad, or you shouldn't listen to that, or not in that sense, but we should really be very careful where we choose to attain and really grasp our full knowledge and place our full attention. So in that, but there's limits, and he goes on to say that there's limits to the common grace. So not only does God give us knowledge, He gives us grace, but He gives us wisdom in our decision making. So even in that, like, the single Christian should not marry a single unbeliever. The Christian educator that wants to open up a school should not partner with unbelievers that have no moral standard for anything. So even in that, we're able to see the differences. We're able to see how God really draws the line, and how there really is no neutrality in any kind of way, and how God really, the biggest difference between the Christian and the non-Christian is that the Christian can turn around and acknowledge God for all that He has done for him, and give Him all the glory for everything that he's doing. The unbeliever is incapable, and the unbeliever doesn't do that. It says the unbeliever hates God. They're dead in their sin, so of course they're not going to be able to do that. So the biggest difference is the fact that we can rejoice in the truth that we have been saved from our sin, and even in that, from a heart perspective, he goes on to say, the we as Christians recognize Christ as the master and lawgiver of all of life. So we see that, we see how the lordship of Christ applies to everything, and to every area, to every part of our lives, and how we choose to really apply these things. So even in that, the chapter was short. It was a blessing, but the biggest thing that I want to leave you guys with is to really acknowledge who you are in Christ, and to really ask yourself a question. We can ask ourselves this question daily: why do we believe what we believe? How do we believe what we believe? And in a sense, we constantly have to examine ourselves in a way where it will show us daily that we are His, that we are Christians, and let that desire for His word, let that desire for prayer grow, and in that we can be confident that we can live for Christ, by Christ, and through Christ. Grace and peace, fam.